Today's lecture is on conservatism. I have a bunch of ism lectures coming up for you, and conservatism is sort of the old-fashioned one, or the one that is trying to prevent change, whereas all these other isms that I'll be telling you about are advocating for change. And we have to kind of, for the 19th century, understand that conservatism and liberalism aren't exactly the same things that we've got conservatism and liberalism in the 21st century. So what conservatism is a kind of belief that tradition is really quite important, that legitimacy is really quite important, that there can be change, but that change needs to be very slow. It's kind of like a tree growing, rather than the opposite of conservatism, which is perhaps revolution, which is, if you think about it, what a revolution is when a wheel turns around completely. So not changing things around completely, not turning things around completely. There can be change in conservatism, but it needs to be slow and it needs to be organic in the sense that it's coming from inside and not from the outside. Hopefully that you can kind of see that I'm hinting at this deal with legitimacy or change coming from outside is kind of what we were talking about yesterday with the Congress of Vienna, where they wanted legitimacy and balance of power and peace, trying to overcome that French Revolutionary period, or the period of time when Napoleon was really upsetting everything in Europe. In addition, conservatism usually goes along with faith over reason. So, tending to be more religious, let's say, rather than tending to be more enlightened. The Enlightenment was a great deal of change, if you think about it, from the way things have been done previously, and it was all about questioning tradition. And so you can understand how conservatism wouldn't really appreciate that very much. Once again, tradition over free inquiry. Free inquiry is what people were doing in the scientific revolution or in the Enlightenment, trying to come up with new ways of doing things, a better way of doing things, challenging what people had said in the past or what people had done in the past. It's also thinking about collective values over individualism. Now, here's where more modern kinds of isms might conflict with our understanding of conservatism or socialism, what have you. Collective values seems like socialism. It seems like everybody together. But in fact, back at this point in time, collective values are kind of like when you think of the medieval period feudalism, where you think of a lord, the local bigwig, who is kind of a father for his children and looking out for his children. Conservatives at this period of time are really more apt to give, let's call it welfare, to the lower classes than a liberal would be. A liberal is really more about their own individual rights to life, liberty, and property. A conservative is really more about the collective whole, a kind of society that sticks together and looks out for each other. The lower classes supporting the upper classes looking out for the lower classes. And then finally, also to some extent, divine law over secular law. Men can write laws, and those laws can be anything. They can be, the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, for example. But they are just based on reason. They're based on what men think. And conservatives at this point in time think that divine law, things that you would find in the Bible and the Ten Commandments, in this whole body of canon law or church law from the whole history of the church, might be more God-inspired, might be more holy than what somebody in the Enlightenment comes up with law. Obviously, you and I both know that all these divine laws are actually written by men at some point in time. But at this point in time, this is how they're understanding things. Are there any questions about that slide? There was a whole mouthful of stuff there explaining what conservatism is. Okay. As always, stop me if you need to. So this conservatism that's always in European history gets a kind of boost, I think, around this period of time that we're talking about, post 1815 or during the French Revolution and going on, because it's reacting to these things that are really all about change. It's reacting to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is really trying to change a lot of things in European society, from the system of crime and punishment, or who gets to have sovereignty, or who gets to be educated, or how religion is dealt with. There's all kinds of things that are being changed by the Enlightenment. The French Revolution is the Enlightenment in action, if you want to think about it in that way. And they're trying to keep a hold over all of these changes that the French Revolution tried to bring along, making everybody equal, allowing more men to have sovereignty and vote, for example. And then all these other isms that we'll talk about too. I'm going to tell you about liberalism. I'm going to tell you about nationalism. Eventually, I'll tell you about socialism. And those things all want change. And so this conservatism is fighting against the change. The Congress of Vienna, as I said, is a perfect representation of a peace treaty that sets up 35 or so years of attempts to stave off change. A conservative would ask, why is all this change necessary? What's it all about? Why do we need to change anything? Things have been going so well for people who believe in conservatism, the people who benefited from the pre-French Revolutionary Europe and maybe lost out during the French Revolution. And so if you think about who those people are, there seem to be three pillars of support for conservatism. And one of the pillars of support, of course, are monarchs, people who view themselves as legitimate rulers. They didn't like a usurper like Napoleon and his family taking over for legitimate monarchs. They also, if you think about Louis the 16th, loses his head in the revolution. And so monarchs are big supporters of conservatism, as are aristocrats. There was a period of time when the monarchs were trying to control aristocrats. What period of time was that, or what do we call that? You got it, absolutist monarchy, or even before that, new monarchy. That's number one, right? Well, now they're together against everybody else because they realize that if too much change happens, then these two groups, monarchs and also the aristocrats, are the ones going to lose out. They're going to lose their heads, quite literally, sometimes. The Catholic Church also is a supporter of conservatism. And I think that makes sense. The Protestant Reformation was all kinds of change, and they lost a lot of power. They lost a lot of adherents, or people who believed in Catholicism. And during the French Revolution, too, if you think about it, the Catholic Church loses out with having their lands seized, and the civil constitution of the clergy really contributes to them losing a lot of power in France until they come back somewhat. So those are the three pillars of support: monarchs, aristocrats, and the Catholic Church. By the way, those are the three groups that lose their head oftentimes in the French Revolution. Later, I think the military will be generally conservative as well. And the more people that states can put into the military, the more conservative oftentimes people come out of the military. They get a good dose of nationalism or patriotism, following orders and stuff, and then they become really good conservatives. I'm going to tell you, too, that peasants are generally conservative as well, especially, or really, I'll say especially if they have enough land. If they've got enough land, then they just want, things to continue the way that they have been continuing up to this point in time. Peasants are generally more religious. Peasants don't usually come into contact with too many new ideas. Peasants don't want really any kind of radical change that's going to hurt them economically. And so peasants generally are conservative unless they don't have enough land. If they don't have enough land, then they're revolutionary in order to get land. We'll see that happening later on. There's a couple of philosophers or proponents of conservatism. One of them is this guy on the left, Edmund Burke, who is British. And then we met this guy yesterday, Prince Clemens von Metternich, the chief minister of Austria. I would say that Burke is a philosopher of conservatism, and then I think Metternich is a guy who puts conservatism into action in this age of Metternich. Edmund Burke writes the reflections on the revolution in France. He does this really pretty early. He does this, I think, in 1790. He's talking about what was happening already, 1789, in France, and he doesn't like what he's seeing. You'd think that a British guy, and in particular this British guy who actually, I think, supported the American revolutionaries against Britain, didn't like what was happening in France. He viewed this as a kind of mobocracy. He viewed the Third Estate, taking power away from their social betters with that idea of the National Assembly as a kind of mobocracy, and he promoted a natural elite. I think we see this in Britain as well. When we talk coming up about who gets to vote in Britain, you'll see that it takes a really long time for the non-elite to actually gain political power. And so Edmund Burke believes that any nation should be led by people who are by birth or by wealth or by education a kind of natural elite, and you shouldn't have popular sovereignty, or you shouldn't turn the mechanism of power over to the mob. He, in some ways, is a predictor of what's going to happen during the Terror, where the sans-culottes, these lower class people, are under the control of Robespierre, or helping Robespierre execute all of these people who are the natural elite in France. And so Burke is rejecting, the idea that everyone is equal, or that representation needs to be done popularly, popular sovereignty. Instead, he thinks it's better to go with, as I say, tradition, conservatism, order and balance and cooperation between classes is really the way that Edmund Burke wants to see society go forward. And for as seemingly radical as Britain is politically, creating a constitutional monarchy before anybody else, as I say, it's really a kind of conservative place, in the sense that there is an elite that runs Britain forever, really, all the way up probably until the 20th century or so. Prince Metternich is, as I say, a guy who is actually putting conservatism into practice. He's in charge of the Habsburg Empire. He's also in charge of the German Confederation, really. And so he's doing these things that seem kind of maybe a little bit sinister, or a little bit anti-free, anti-liberal. He's got a whole host of spies, and he's got a police force, and he's got border controls, and he has censorship. He imprisons people. Sometimes there are a few people who get executed who are dissenters, people who are against the Habsburgs or against conservative rule. These are what you and I might call autocratic sorts of things, trying to keep change at bay, for example. He's using diplomacy. He's using the Holy Alliance in order to stop change from happening. He is also trying to boost Habsburg power, or keep the Habsburgs from losing power through conservatism. And really, he looks at the middle classes as an agent of change. The middle classes have been up and coming. They've been changing themselves really since the beginning of this class, with the beginning of towns and trade. And he thinks that the middle classes, getting more and more powerful economically, getting infected with the ideas of the Enlightenment, wanting to change everything to topple the aristocracy, he thinks that the middle classes are stirring up the lower classes with these very disturbing isms of nationalism and liberalism. Nationalism in particular is a threat to the Habsburg Empire, as we'll see, because the Habsburg Empire has about 11 different ethnicities or nationalities. These things could be separate nations if they broke away from the Habsburg Empire. And then also the Habsburg Empire is an autocracy, so liberalism, the idea that people have political rights and are free and maybe should have a parliament, would also be a threat to the Habsburgs. So it makes sense from a point of view that Metternich would be a conservative. So conservatism will be attacked by revolutions in the 1820s, 1830, and then most spectacularly in 1848. And then these other isms that are going on at this period of time, the nationalism, the liberalism, eventually socialism, those isms are challenging conservatism too, and conservatism is trying to fight against the change that those isms want to push forward. But I think you and I both know that change is inevitable, and eventually nationalism will win and liberalism will win out. But conservatives are fighting against it, especially in Eastern Europe, where you have that, holy alliance, Prussia, Austria, and Russia as autocratic states that really don't want to change. Now, I get all excited about these 1848 revolutions that happened throughout Europe, but I'm going to go ahead and give you a kind of spoiler. There really isn't very much that changes in 1848. There's a lot of revolutions, but really I think the only one that's completely successful for a very short period of time is the one that happens. Well, you can probably guess. What's the most revolutionary country in Europe? Who just had a revolution? Yeah, exactly, France. Yeah, France has a revolution. You'll get tired of it perhaps, but France has a revolution like every generation starting in 1789. I think there are, I don't know, I think I counted five of them from 1789 to 1968. 1968 is going to be the last one, oddly. Good.